I'm sure we'll squeeze the truth out of something. Welcome, everyone, to Mail Fuzz TV. I am Peter, and I am here today to talk about The X-Files Season 1, Episode 21. It's called Tooms. So, spoilers for the episode. What's funny is I clearly didn't remember the name of the character from Squeeze, which is Tooms. It's Eugene Tooms. It says that in the description. So I read the description last week, and I thought it was referring to a villain from before the show, kind of like we've had before, where someone from Mulder's past is released from prison, and there's antics that come from that. I did not realize it was actually a character or a story that we'd already had in the show. So this episode is a sequel to a previous episode. And normally you wouldn't use the word sequel when talking about TV episodes because, in a way, every episode is a sequel to every previous episode. But it's the best way to describe this because X-Files is so distinct, standalone episodes typically, that you have this episode that is entirely about bringing back a villain from a previous episode and doing more with it, which tells me at the very least they knew they were onto a winner and they wanted to do more with that character. Now, they don't leave it open here at the end of this one for more. They finish it off. The Tomb story seemingly is done, barring some weird way to bring it back later that I can't predict. So that's all fine, and I expected good direction from David Nutter, and I definitely got that. There's some standout moments and just stylistic touches here that I thought were really good, which I'll get into. I guess the first thing to say, though, is to compare it to Squeeze. How does it hold up against that? It's a solid sequel to that episode, but it's not as good as that episode. And I think that was a tall order to even expect it to be as good as that episode. I think the main thing that holds this back from being quite as good as Squeeze is that there's not as much of it where the villain Tooms is hiding and waiting to attack someone. There was a lot more horror sequences in that original episode, and there's some in this episode, don't get me wrong, and the ones we do get are very good, but there's a bit more of him in broad daylight. There's a lot more just kind of focusing on him as a person, sort of almost like Psycho 2 with Norman Bates. It's not the same story by any means, but just in the same way that in the second Psycho movie, there's a lot more of him just trying to live a life. Don't get me wrong, here he's clearly building up to killing someone, which is what Mulder's scared of, but I think that does make it feel distinctly different from that first one, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It would be maybe a bit underwhelming if they just tried to repeat what they did before. But at the same time, what made that first one so good was all the horror movie sequences that it had. And this one has a couple of good ones, but it felt like it was definitely had more time devoted to other stuff. So the way this one breaks down is that we start off with Tooms in his hospital room or his prison cell, a bit of both, kind of an Arkham Asylum type thing. And his doctor, his therapist, is adamant that he's ready to leave, that he is fit for society. And this made me pause for a second. Not literally pause the episode, but just pause in my brain because I was like, wait a minute. It's not even been a year, right? These are both taking place in the same season of the show. So I actually had to try and think back to exactly what crimes he was put away for. Obviously, we know he killed several people, 4 people recently, and at least 10 going back 30-year cycles. Obviously, they wouldn't let him out less than a year if they knew he'd done all that, or if they'd proven that he'd done all that. So I was like, okay, what did he actually go away for? Luckily, later in the episode, they do actually clearly say what crimes they convicted him for and why he was locked away, and it was just the attempted attack on Scully. That was the only thing they actually proved in a court of law, if you will. So, okay, fair enough, right? They don't know everything he's done, which actually leads to one of the best and yet most frustrating scenes with Mulder in this entire show so far, where he is called at this hearing for his release to give evidence as to why he shouldn't be released, and Mulder starts off pretty good, right? He makes it clear that they found livers and body remains of several victims at his address. That is a very good piece of evidence that would maybe convince the people deciding that this board or whoever they are that he should not be released. That's solid concrete facts. They found body parts and organs at his place. But Mulder doesn't stop there. He has to start talking about the 30-year cycle, about him living for over 100 years, about him eating livers, and stretching his body to fit through things. Now, we know that's all true, because we're the audience of a TV show, and we've seen this son of a bitch do it. But he sounds like a madman trying to explain all this, even when people are trying to get him to shut up. He effectively hands Tooms a ticket to leave. He hands it over. Now, they might still have sided that way, don't get me wrong. They might have still ultimately decided to let him go. But he guaranteed, he ensured that they were going to let him go, because he made the argument against him sound so silly and ridiculous that it almost just, it was handing him a free pass. Like, here you go, you get to leave, Tooms. And of course, Mulder is then very scared that he's going to kill again, because he needs one more victim to complete this cycle. And that becomes the premise of the rest of the episode, by and large. Yeah, I was sitting there shaking my head. It just, Mulder being an idiot. He's like, I might have sounded crazy, but at least it was all the truth. You know what? Sometimes, strategically, only saying the parts that sound reasonable and you can prove would probably actually achieve a better outcome. Because here, withholding the crazier stuff that you can't prove would have maybe kept them off the streets. And would have kept them incarcerated, so that it would have kept people safe. There would have been a genuine outcome and reason to not just tell everything you know. Because all you've done is put people in danger. Partially yourself. So that's going on, and Scully shows up late to the hearing because she's actually being grilled out by Agent Skinner. The smoking man's there, and they're going on about Mulder's unorthodox methods, talking about why he's doing things this way, that way, these are very irregular, blah blah blah. And Scully's defense for it, of course, is that one, the cases the X-Files take on are very strange cases and can't really be investigated to the letter of the book, right? Not the exact same way regular cases are investigated. But the even better defense for it is that we have a 75% clearance rate of our cases, which is higher than every other department. So we're actually doing a better job than the rest of the FBI. He doesn't really have a good comeback for that, but he says it's the only thing that's stopping them from just shutting the X-Files down. And that's not entirely true. We know that there's friends in higher places keeping the X-Files afloat. That's been something we've been aware of for a while. But they're basically telling her to toe the line, bring it in, stop doing things unorthodox, and start playing by the rules. So she shows up late to the hearing, and she's honest about all this to Mulder pretty much. She says that this is what they want. They want us to get in line. So that raises the sort of it raises that specter over the episode. So there's a little bit of drama to the fact that Mulder is immediately investigating and tailing and surveying Tooms because he's convinced Tooms is going to kill again. And this is not illegal surveillance. He's not been authorized to do this by the FBI. He is doing this on his own because he just knows that he's going to kill again. So Mulder's immediately doing something he shouldn't be, whereas Scully is going to go and try and prove that Tooms is guilty of all these old murders that they've not been able to prove thus far. And I was surprised that they even brought in the old sheriff or the old cop from that episode who was in the old folks' home, and he helps with some more evidence and finding the original victim that they believe there might be, because all the bodies for all the other victims were all found, but this one wasn't. So they've got reason to think that the reason why he hid that one was because it had evidence or had a reason to suggest who it was, or who he was, or that he was guilty. So we get a whole bit of that. I mean, Scully does resist a little bit when she's like, hey, that this is unorthodox methods where you have to haven't used to investigate all these old crimes. But she goes along with it. And actually, one of the best scenes of the episode, and arguably of the season, comes in this episode. They've been kind of separated for a bit, and they've been doing their own things. Mulder following Tooms, Scully working with the old cop and doing some science forensic stuff to find bodies in concrete and whatnot. They have this scene where Mulder is still surveying, he's still outside, just watching the house that Tooms is living in, which I I don't know if this is a real thing, but he effectively goes into like a foster care program, even though he's an adult. It's kind of like these people are like, oh, we help. I don't know if it's convicts or maybe specifically like this type of convict, like a patient who's had mental health issues. I'm not sure, but like they're kind of like part of the rules of his or conditions of his release is that he has to live with this couple for a while. So Mulder's watching this house, and Scully comes and says, "Hey, I brought you some food and stuff, but you have been watching them for like over a day and a half now. You need to go and sleep. I'll relieve you. I'll keep watch, kind of thing." And that's not what makes it great, of course. That's just kind of the setup of the scene. But what's so good about it is Scully and Mulder kind of they bond a little bit here. They kind of get some feelings out on the table a little bit, where Scully basically says that she's okay with putting her career on the line to help Mulder. In a way that just outright says it, and it feels like, you know, she's come a ways away from that first episode, way back at the start of the season. It feels like over the course of the season, you get this idea that she sympathizes with Mulder because she believes in his passion for what he does, and that he believes in a lot of this stuff. And with this case in particular, she also believes this guy's guilty. This is not one of these cases where she's being skeptical anymore. But she says this, and Mulder, you know, doesn't want her and she says that because Mulder says that he doesn't want her record to be tarnished for working with him when he's doing something he's not supposed to. I feel like he could have shown that concern out several times earlier in the season before now, but still, it was nice to hear him say it, and it felt like this little moment where, hey, these two are actually really close friends now who are looking out for each other. They've got each other's back. Over the course of the season, it feels like Scully is trusting her superiors less and less, but trusting Mulder more. And that's an interesting sort of direction to take the characters in, because their chemistry and their friendship is kind of the heart of the show in a lot of ways. So that was good stuff. And I also liked a little bit here where she calls him Fox. Like, she starts off this sort of more like, we're getting personal. I'm going to show that I care. And she calls him Fox. And Mulder just laughs and says, I even made my parents call me Mulder. So she switches back to Mulder. But I like the attempt to get more personal by using his first name. I just don't know. I got a little sort of chuckle at that. But it also develops their relationship a little bit, because it's something now she knows about him. So yeah, that scene was really good. That felt like a nice little culmination of their friendship building over the course of the season. A lot of the stuff before this point in the episode is Mulder following Tooms, and Tooms has got his job. Like, he got his old job back like immediately. There wasn't even a question if his employer would want him back, but he's back in the animal, not control, but he basically picks up all the dead animals that pop up all over the city. Which leads to one of the creepier things that he does in this episode, actually. He picks up a dead rat, and he's wearing latex gloves, as someone doing this would, I would imagine. And he picks it up, he's looking at it all creepy, and he puts it in the van. But when he turns back round, he starts aggressively sucking his fingers that have touched the dead rat, and he's really into it. It's pretty nasty, but it was a very memorable moment, so I can approve. But they do this effect. One of the directorial touches of this episode is whenever we get his POV, when he's looking at a potential victim, because I think it's this scene where he sees like a woman over at a food cart, and he looks at her, and it's almost like the start of a romantic moment in like another movie where he's staring at her longingly. But it's creepier because he's got like a really intense look in his face, and his perspective when we see it, she's in color, but the rest of the world is in black and white. And we see that a couple of times when he's looking at people that he wants to kill. So like he's sniffing their scent or something, because he's an animal. So those are good little moments. I actually also, speaking of direction, when they're in the hearing and we're getting the testimonies and stuff, there's a moment where it really emphasizes the gavel being hammered and focusing in on Tooms' reaction to what's going on, like he's getting ready to like beast out almost, like his eyes start to go into that sort of more animalistic yellow color, but then he kind of calms down. But it does a good job of really building the tension in the courtroom scene, and then likewise here with his hunger, his desire for another victim, for a liver that he's so destined for. this effectively all leads to Scully getting the idea to test the new body they've found from the original murders back in the 30s for bite marks and seeing if they can prove it was him, because there was a bite mark in one of the bones or something like that. And sure enough, it does turn out to be Tooms. But the big thing here, though, after Scully takes over for Mulder and the surveillance, is that we get this great moment when she walks back to her car where you see that the boot, or sorry, the trunk for the Americans, is slightly open. Tooms is actually snuck into the back of Mulder's car. We get this great little sequence where Mulder's fallen asleep to TV and the 50s version of The Fly is playing, and he's fallen asleep to that. And Tooms sneaks into the apartment by coming through the vent. As he does, the screws unscrew. I was looking for another word, but they unscrew, they come out. Obviously you're thinking, shit, Mulder's in trouble here, but what he's actually here to do, probably because he knows that killing Mulder would be very suspicious, he is seemingly aware of those ideas that this will look bad if Mulder turns up dead. Instead, he starts to injure himself, seemingly to frame Mulder for being abusive. And we see him at a doctor's getting examined, and he's got a footprint on his face. He's clearly taking one of Mulder's shoes and just imprinted it onto his face. But as we see, some of the injuries he has, he clearly just does with his body, because he just pops in his shoulder again. His shoulder's dislocated, and he just sort of pops it in like it's nothing. But he blames Mulder for this. And maybe if I was going to critique the episode, is that it does feel a little lazy how we resolve this. Because Mulder's called into the FBI office with Skinner, and he gets grilled out for it. This is after the police have came to his apartment. And Scully defends him and says that he was with her. Because obviously she knows that he didn't do this, even though she's kind of lying about giving him an alibi. But she insists on this. They kind of think she's lying, but they have to kind of take her statement. The smoking man's there this entire time as well, listening to all this. And we get a whole speech here about how, Mulder, you were gifted, you're one of the best in the Bureau, but you want to do the X-Files sort of thing. It sort of reiterates kind of the core premise of the show and where Mulder stands with the rest of the FBI. It's interesting though, because we know the smoking man's involved in all this shit. He clearly knows about all this weird stuff. He's above the conspiracies, he's involved in them all. Which is why at the end of the episode, when Scully's handed in a report about what happens, and Skinner turns around and says, "Do you believe them?" The smoking man just says, "Of course I do. Of course I know this is all true." That's a really interesting reaction. I kind of enjoyed that moment. But it does kind of wrap up. There almost is no having to convince anyone really that he didn't do this crime. There's very little fallout for it other than this one conversation really that he has with Skinner, where he's having to sort of justify his actions and whatnot. That's really the only scene that kind of results from this frame job that Tooms tries to do. And then immediately they're all just investigating Tooms again like nothing happened. So maybe that is a slight critique, that it does kind of feel like that was almost not that important, all things considered, given the episode. It is nice to see Scully stick up for him, of course, and that follows on naturally from the previous conversation where she's got his back, and that is good to see. Maybe that felt a little bit easy, I guess, but I mean, Skinner does say, "Oh, you came really close, right, on this one, and if you get us any closer, no friends in the capital will help you. You'll be screwed," kind of thing. It's kind of, again, it doesn't really amount to much directly here specifically. So the climax of the episode's a lot of fun, though. Tooms does get his final victim. It's actually his therapist that comes by to see him, and this therapist has always kind of felt like, there's a very type of specific character that this therapist falls into, a character trope, if you will, is the therapist who is convinced their patient who was dangerous is not dangerous anymore, but it feels kind of slimy because it's like, oh, he's doing this because he wants to pat himself in the back because he's a great therapist and this is good for his career, that he's rehabilitated someone like this. And I feel like there's a lot of movies and TV shows that have had this type of character, this type of therapist. And he gets his comeuppance because he ends up being the victim. The actor actually playing the therapist, I recognized, and it was really bugging me what he was from. And I actually don't remember the character because it's been a while since I watched this show. But he was in The Wire, which is clearly what I know his face from. But I cannot remember for the life of me who he was in The Wire. But I do know his face. So I'm just pointing that out. The actor's name is Paul Ben Victor. I didn't even think of this till I said it out loud, but he's just got 3 first names, and the second 2 are hyphenated. But yeah, Paul Ben Victor. It's actually just listing people, but yeah. So yeah, he dies, and we kind of know what he's up to at this point as well, because he's ripping newspaper up. And I didn't remember this initially, but as soon as I saw him do it, I'm like, oh yeah, he made like a cocoon almost, or a hibernation tomb out of newspaper and like goo back in his first episode. So that's clearly what he's building up to. So once this has happened, Mulder and Scully deduce that he's probably going to go and hibernate, and he would probably go back to where he usually hibernates, but that building was torn down and now there's like a shopping mall there. Would you believe it? But they still think he might have tried. So they go into where he would have went to hibernate, and they're looking around, and they see a panel on the floor at the bottom of this escalator. So Mulder takes off his jacket, rolls up his sleeves, and goes crawling under the floor. And sure enough, he finds the cocoon, and we get like this final set piece. Like, I was just kind of feeling whatever about until it got to this moment where he finds the cocoon, and Tooms like bursts out of it covered in yellow goo, and like is grabbing at Mulder, and Mulder's like crawling to get away from him, and it's a really good little intense sequence. Like I think at this right before this point in the episode, I was probably feeling like this was a decent episode, but it maybe hadn't wowed me in its horror sequences yet. There's a couple of okay ones. You know, Tooms being in the trunk was alright. Tooms being in Mulder's apartment was pretty solid. And they do find a way to give him a few of those cool moments where his eyes are lit. Like, you get the sort of the line of light across his eyes, but everything else is in shadow. They do that a couple of times in the episode, but not in as good ways as they did back in the first one. But this final set piece where Mulder's in serious danger and he's actually acting like a feral animal, that was actually a lot of fun, and it was good horror movie stuff. And even the ending where Mulder gets out and they hit the button to turn on the escalator, so Tooms just gets sucked up the escalator, like underneath it, and as the escalator's coming down, you just see some blood coming down each step, as if he's been like churned into the entire gears in the machine, and there's just a bit of blood on each escalator step as it's coming down. So that was a fun visual. It was a really fun little set piece to end this story. That's the episode pretty much, barring a little bit of reflection with Mulder and Scully at the end, and the scene that I mentioned already with Skinner. It's, I think, ultimately there was almost no way that this was going to be as good as Squeeze, and I think part of it is because so much of it was like discovering exactly how he did what he did, the several horror sequences that the episode had, whereas this one kind of almost goes into a lot more prevention, which is fine and makes a lot of sense, but it's just not quite as exciting as that stuff. And it also focuses maybe a lot more on the cycle and the murders from before, and that was all cool mythology stuff they had in the first one, but this one maybe leans on it a bit more because it doesn't have as much of the horror stuff, and that balance again makes it just slightly less great as an episode, I would say, but only compared to Squeeze. I think on its own this is a really solid episode. It's a solid follow-up to that first one. It just isn't as good as Squeeze, and that's okay. But I think you have to inherently compare it a little bit because it is, it's a sequel to that episode. But there's some interesting stuff in here. The character stuff with Mulder and Scully was kind of sweet and encouraging, and shows how much their characters have evolved over the course of this season, in particular their friendship and camaraderie. And then the stuff with Skinner and the Smoking Man, while nothing particularly new, there's just a couple of little interactions there that do feel intriguing from an overall mythology sense. So, there's some little nuggets there for the overall show going forward, but for the most part, it was dealing as a solid sequel to Squeeze and giving a conclusion to that villain. Which, again, like, I feel like most episodes they wouldn't bother doing that, even if they do leave it on a he's still there kind of thing. But with this one, I think they knew they had a winner with that. So, but they also made the wise choice to not leave it open for another one, because if this one was a little bit weaker than Squeeze, then it stands to reason that a third episode about Tooms would be a bit weaker again, probably. So I think they made the wise choice to finish the story definitively here as far as this character goes. That's the episode. That is Tooms. Let me know what you thought of this one in the comments below. Of course, you can like the video, which helps out a bunch. More people will find the channel and the show. And of course, you can support us over at patreon.com/MailFuzzTV, which is obviously the most help you can do, and get some bonuses for your trouble, including a monthly review of classic Columbo episodes, which I'm doing, if that's of interest. But there's a bunch of stuff for all the movie podcasts and things like that, so go check it out. That's me. Thank you very much for joining me. I always appreciate it. I'll see you next time. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?